History often remembers kings and queens, but sometimes the most shocking tragedies belong to those standing just one step away from the throne. George Boleyn was one of those people. A young nobleman, a poet, a diplomat, and the brother of Anne Boleyn, the second wife of the infamous King Henry VIII. His life should have been a story of wealth, success, and respect. Instead, it became one of the darkest and most heartbreaking examples of how politics could destroy a person without mercy. His story is a chilling reminder of how quickly fortune can turn, and how dangerous it is to fly too close to the sun. George was born into a rising family. The Boleyns were not ancient English nobles, but they were clever, ambitious, and incredibly well-connected. His father, Thomas Boleyn, moved quickly through the ranks at court, forming alliances, serving as an ambassador, and gaining the trust of powerful men. George grew up in this environment of ambition, receiving a top-tier education that made him charming, witty, and deeply confident. Some people at court called him arrogant, while others called him brilliant. But everyone agreed he was talented. He was the kind of man who could light up a room with his sharp mind and equally sharp tongue. When his sister Anne caught the unwavering attention of King Henry VIII, the entire Boleyn family was catapulted into the highest echelons of power. George was showered with titles, income, and influence. He wasn't just the Queen's brother. He became an important voice in political discussions, a respected diplomat, and a key figure in the religious Reformation sweeping England. He could read Latin, write beautiful poetry, and debate complex theological ideas with the best scholars in the kingdom. Many nobles envied him, and some even feared his rapid ascent. But standing beside a queen, especially a queen like Anne Boleyn, was a very dangerous place to be. The closer someone was to Henry VIII, the more enemies watched their every move, just waiting for a chance to strike. The court of Henry VIII was a viper's nest, a world where alliances shifted like sand and loyalty was a currency that could be spent in an instant. The old aristocratic families looked down on the Boleyns as upstarts, newcomers who had charmed their way into power. They were jealous of the family's influence and waited for the moment they would stumble. And that moment came sooner than anyone expected. When Anne failed to give Henry the one thing he desperately wanted, a male heir, the same nobles who had smiled and bowed to the Boleyns suddenly turned cold. The king's affection, once a shield for the family, began to waver. Henry's frustration grew into a dangerous impatience, and the Boleyns' enemies saw their opportunity. In a world where rumors were weapons and ambition meant survival, George Boleyn, with his quick wit and powerful position, became an easy and irresistible target. His confidence, once seen as a strength, was now twisted into arrogance. His closeness to his sister, once a sign of family loyalty, would soon be used against them in the most horrific way imaginable. The plot against the Boleyns was orchestrated by one of the most cunning political operators in English history. Thomas Cromwell, once an ally of the Boleyns, realized that their influence was waning and that the king's favor was shifting. To secure his own position, he needed to remove Anne and her powerful faction from the board entirely. He began a secret investigation, looking for any dirt, any rumor, any hint of misconduct that could be used to bring them down. He started by arresting a court musician named Mark Smeaton. Under torture, Smeaton confessed to having an affair with Queen Anne. This was the crack in the dam Cromwell needed. Once one confession was secured, no matter how coerced, the floodgates opened. Cromwell's agents quickly rounded up other men in the Queen's circle, including Sir Henry Norreys, a close friend of the King, and Sir Francis Weston. The charges were shocking: adultery with the Queen, which in itself was high treason. But Cromwell needed to make sure the case was airtight, and that meant implicating someone so close to Anne that the scandal would be undeniable. He turned his attention to her own brother, George Boleyn. The accusation against George was the most monstrous of all: incest. It was a charge designed not just to convict, but to utterly destroy the Boleyn name forever. The evidence was flimsy, based almost entirely on hearsay and twisted interpretations of casual conversations. The main witness against George was his own wife, Jane Parker, Lady Rochford. Historians have debated her motives for centuries. Was she a jealous woman seeking revenge on a husband she disliked? Or was she a terrified pawn, forced by Cromwell to give false testimony to save her own skin? Whatever her reasons, Jane claimed she had overheard a conversation where Anne told George that the king was impotent, and she implied that their relationship was inappropriately close. This was all Cromwell needed. With the queen accused of adultery with multiple men, including her own brother, the scandal was catastrophic. George Boleyn was arrested and thrown into the Tower of London, the same fortress where his sister was imprisoned. Their world had crumbled in a matter of days. The family that had risen so high was now facing complete annihilation. George, the brilliant diplomat, poet, and courtier, was now a prisoner accused of the most vile crimes imaginable. The trial was a farce, a show put on for the public to justify what the king had already decided. George and the other accused men were brought before a court of their peers, but the verdict was a foregone conclusion. The evidence against them was weak, circumstantial, and likely fabricated. George, known for his sharp mind and eloquence, defended himself brilliantly. He argued his case with such skill and passion that many in the courtroom were said to have believed in his innocence. He cleverly dissected the charges, pointing out the inconsistencies and the absurdity of the accusations. At one point, he was handed a note detailing the most shocking charge. The insistent was told to answer it without reading it aloud, as it was too obscene for the court to hear. Defiantly, George read the accusation out loud anyway, to show the world how ridiculous and vile it was. For a moment, it seemed like he might sway the jury. The onlookers were impressed, and some even wagered that he would be acquitted. But the judges were under immense pressure from the king and Cromwell. No amount of logic or eloquence could save him. The jury, which included his own father-in-law and other men who were his rivals, delivered the inevitable verdict. Guilty. George Boleyn was sentenced to death on May 17, 1536. Just 2 days before his sister Anne was to be executed, he was led to the scaffold on Tower Hill. The other 4 men accused with him were also executed that day. Even in his final moments, George displayed remarkable courage and dignity. He gave a speech to the crowd, as was the custom. He did not confess to the crimes he was accused of adultery and incest, but he did admit to being a sinner in a general sense, as was expected of anyone facing execution. He urged the crowd to live a righteous life and to trust in God, not in the fickle fortunes of the court. He spoke about the vanity of worldly ambition and warned others not to be seduced by the glamour of court life, a world he knew all too well. His final words were calm, composed, and deeply moving. He asked for the crowd's prayers and then knelt down, placing his head on the block. With one swift strike of the axe, the life of George Boleyn, Lord Rochford, poet, diplomat, and brother to our queen, was over. He was only about 32 years old. His body, along with the others, was unceremoniously buried in a nearby chapel. 2 days later, his sister Anne met the same fate. The Boleyn family's power was shattered. Their enemies had won. George's story is a brutal testament to the ruthlessness of Tudor politics. He was a man of immense talent and promise, but he was destroyed not because of what he did, but because of who he was and who his sister was. He was a pawn in a deadly game of power, sacrificed to satisfy a king's desire for a new wife and a male heir, and to clear the way for his political rivals. Today, George Boleyn is often remembered as a footnote in the dramatic story of his sister, Anne. But his own life and tragic death deserve to be remembered. He represents the human cost of absolute power and the dark side of ambition. His story serves as a chilling reminder that in the treacherous world of kings and queens, even the brightest stars can be extinguished in an instant. Thank you for watching. If you found this story as compelling as we did, please hit the like button. Subscribe to our channel for more hidden histories. And let us know in the comments what you think about the tragic fate of George Boleyn. We'll see you next time. To truly understand the tragic fall of George Boleyn, we can't just look at the man himself. We have to dive into the world he inhabited, the glittering, dangerous court of King Henry VIII. On the surface, it was a masterpiece of Renaissance splendor. Imagine the finest silks and velvets, the air filled with music from lutes and harpsichords, the grand halls echoing with laughter during lavish banquets and intricate dances. It was a constant performance of wealth, culture, and power, designed to impress not just England, but all of Europe. But beneath this shimmering veneer of gold, jewels, and courtly manners, a silent, relentless war was being waged every single day. This wasn't a war fought with swords and armies, but with whispers, secrets, and calculated smiles. Every courtier, every nobleman, every advisor was a player in a high-stakes game. The ultimate prize. Influence. The goal. To capture and hold the king's favor, because in Henry's court, proximity to the king was the only currency that mattered. Every family schemed to climb higher up the social ladder, often by pushing another family down. The most terrifying and fundamental rule of this world was brutally simple. Your entire life, your reputation, your very existence, could be obliterated by a single, well-placed rumor. It didn't even have to be true. It just had to be believable enough, or whispered into the right ear at the right time. And if that rumor reached the king and ignited his notoriously short temper, his anger alone was enough to sign a death warrant. The king's displeasure was a death sentence, waiting to be written. The people who navigated this treacherous landscape were not amateurs. They were masters of the political arts. Espionage was a daily routine. They had servants listening at doors and friends reporting on conversations. Manipulation was a finely honed skill, used to turn allies against each other or to subtly guide the king's decisions. Flattery was an art form, a constant stream of praise, designed to soothe the king's massive ego. And betrayal. Betrayal was simply a tool, a strategy to be deployed when necessary. In this environment, sincerity was a liability. Courtiers hid their true thoughts and feelings behind masks of polite smiles and agreeable nods. You could never be sure if the person congratulating you on a recent success was genuinely happy for you or secretly plotting your downfall. Even the sacred bond of family loyalty could shatter in an instant if a person's own position or survival was on the line. One wrong step, one misspoken word, could instantly transform your closest allies into your most dangerous enemies, all scrambling to distance themselves from you before the king's wrath fell on them too. At the very center of this swirling vortex of ambition and paranoia was King Henry VIII himself. He was a man of staggering contradictions, a whirlwind of unpredictable moods. One day, he could be the most generous monarch imaginable, bestowing vast estates, prestigious titles, and bags of gold upon a favored courtier. The very next day, driven by suspicion or a perceived slight, he could accuse that same person of high treason, a charge from which there was often no escape. The emotional state of this one man dictated the political climate of the entire kingdom. Henry's desires shaped everyone's actions. He craved absolute power, unquestioning obedience, and, above all else, a legitimate male heir to secure his dynasty. This obsession with his son made him vulnerable to influence. Every ambitious nobleman knew that if they could offer a solution to the king's great matter, or align themselves with a woman who might provide an heir, they could gain immense power. This created a poisonous, hyper-competitive atmosphere where rivals constantly spread lies to discredit each other. Old, established noble families, with bloodlines stretching back for centuries, simmered with resentment towards the new men, those who rose to prominence based on merit or the king's favor, not their pedigree. For women at court, the scrutiny was even more intense. Their behavior, their piety, their fertility, and their loyalty were constantly judged. They were pawns in the dynastic games of their families, their value often reduced to their ability to forge a powerful alliance or produce a male child. For men, the constant fear was being on the wrong side of a political shift, of backing the wrong faction and finding themselves suddenly out in the cold, or worse. In T's court, one mistake didn't just mean a setback. It could mean the end of your family line, the confiscation of all your property, and a very public, very brutal execution on Tower Hill. Into this glittering, venomous world stepped George Boleyn. He was the epitome of the new Renaissance man. Young, brilliant, highly educated, and radiating ambition. He was fluent in French, a gifted poet and diplomat, and he possessed a sharp wit and a confident, sometimes arrogant, demeanor. He wasn't afraid to speak his mind, and his intelligence earned him a place in the king's inner circle. He was respected, yes, but he was also deeply envied and widely disliked. His critics saw his confidence as hubris. Some powerful figures at court felt he was far too close to the king for a man of his relatively humble origins. Others, who opposed the religious reformation that the Boleyns championed, saw him as a dangerous heretic. Many believed his fierce, unwavering support for his sister, Queen Anne, was a threat to their own influence. They watched as the Boleyn faction seemed to dominate the court, and their resentment grew with each passing day. But the most significant factor working against George was his family's spectacular rise. When Anne Boleyn captured the king's heart and became queen, she didn't just change her own destiny. She upended the entire political order of England. The Boleyns had effectively leapfrogged over the heads of the great ancient noble families. The Howards, the Courtenays, the Percys. These families, who considered themselves the rightful counselors of the king, were pushed aside. They seethed with a deep, burning resentment, believing the Boleyns were upstarts who had stolen their rightful place through seduction and manipulation. So when the first cracks began to appear in the marriage of Henry and Anne, when the king's initial passion began to cool and his frustration over the lack of a male heir turned to anger, the court sensed blood in the water. The Boleyns, many enemies, who had been waiting patiently in the shadows, saw their opportunity. Powerful men like Thomas Cromwell, once an ally, began to shift their lead. They started quietly gathering information, forging alliances with Anne's rivals, and meticulously preparing to strike. Thank you so much for watching. If you're fascinated by the drama and danger of the Tudor court, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next chapter in this incredible story. See you next time. Imagine being born into one of England's most ambitious families, gifted with a brilliant mind and destined for greatness. This was the world of George Boleyn. He wasn't just Anne Boleyn's brother. He was a star in his own right, a man whose intelligence and charm lit up the Tudor court, but whose dazzling rise would ultimately cast a fatal shadow. From his earliest days, George was groomed for success. While other noble sons focused solely on hunting and swordplay, George immersed himself in books. He learned languages, devouring classical poetry and philosophy. In an age where a sharp mind was a sharp weapon, George was armed to the teeth. His education wasn't just for show, it was a tool for diplomacy, and he wielded it with masterful skill. As a young man, he was sent to France, the glittering, sophisticated heart of Renaissance Europe. Here, among the most cultured courts, George didn't just fit in. He shone. He charmed seasoned diplomats and impressed foreign kings with his wit and deep knowledge. He was the perfect tutor, courtier, handsome, articulate, and fiercely intelligent. He was building a reputation not just as a Boleyn but as a formidable figure in European politics. Back in England, his sister Anne was capturing the king's attention, and as her star ascended, it pulled the entire Boleyn family into the stratosphere. When King Henry VIII became obsessed with Anne, the Boleyns transformed from a well-respected family into the most powerful force in the kingdom. And George was right at the center of this whirlwind ascent. Henry showered him with honors. George was granted the title Viscount Rochford, a significant promotion that made him a powerful peer of the realm. This wasn't just a fancy title. It came with real influence. He took his seat in the House of Lords, where his voice carried weight on critical matters of state. He was a key player in the intricate political chess game of Henry's court, involved in everything from foreign policy to the seismic religious changes sweeping the nation. Many historians argue that George was one of the brightest minds at court, perhaps even more politically astute than his famous father, Thomas Boleyn. Henry often sought his counsel, valuing his sharp intellect and persuasive arguments. George was a passionate advocate for religious reform, aligning with his sister Anne's progressive beliefs. They envisioned an England free from the Pope's control, a vision that excited reformers but terrified the old guard. But in the viper's nest of the Tudor court, success bred jealousy. His rapid rise didn't go unnoticed, and it certainly wasn't universally celebrated. Other noble families, who had held power for generations, watched the Boleyns with suspicion and envy. They saw George not as a talented statesman, but as an upstart, an obstacle to their own ambitions. His influence over the king was particularly alarming to them. George's personality didn't help him make friends among the insecure elite. He had a quick, cutting wit, and wasn't afraid to use it. He would openly mock nobles who believed their ancient family names entitled them to respect they had earned. In a court where pride was everything, and insults were never forgotten, George's sharp tongue made him dangerous enemies. These were men who would wait, patiently, for a chance to settle the score. Yet, from George's perspective, his position seemed unassailable. He was the brother of the king's great love, soon to be queen. He had the king's ear and his respect. He trusted in his sister's power and in the security of his family's standing. He couldn't see the storm clouds gathering on the horizon. He was blind to the fact that Henry's obsessive love for Anne was a fickle flame, already beginning to flicker. And he was unaware of the powerful men, led by the calculating Thomas Cromwell, who were quietly plotting the complete and utter destruction of the Boleyn dynasty. When Anne was finally crowned Queen of England, George's influence reached its zenith. He was her closest confidant, her chief strategist, and her most loyal defender. He navigated the treacherous political waters on her behalf, championing her causes and protecting her interests. He was the rock she leaned on, the brother who stood by her side against a court full of enemies. To those who longed for a return to the old Wistu Queen Catherine and the Catholic, George Boleyn was more than just an annoyance. He was a formidable barrier. He and Anne represented a new, modern England, and to bring them down was to turn back the tide of history. The reformers saw him as a champion. His enemies saw him as the final, frustrating obstacle standing between them and the king. His rise had been meteoric, a stunning climb from a country gentleman's son to one of the most powerful men in the kingdom. But the Tudor court operated on a simple, brutal law of physics. The higher you climb, the harder you fall. For George Boleyn, the fall would not just be a loss of power or prestige. It would be absolute, catastrophic, and final. The very qualities that had fueled his ascent, his intelligence, his loyalty to his sister, and his sharp wit would soon be twisted into weapons used to orchestrate his doom. The stage was set for one of the most shocking and tragic downfalls in English history. Thank you for watching. If you were fascinated by the story of George Boleyn's rise, be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell. In our next video, we'll explore the dark conspiracy and the devastating accusations that led to his tragic end. You won't want to miss it. Henry VIII's greatest obsession wasn't power, wealth, or even love. It was a son. A male heir was the ultimate guarantee of security. The only way to secure the fledgling Tudor dynasty on the throne of England. Without a son, the Wars of the Roses, that bloody conflict that had brought his father to power, could easily erupt again. Every person in his court understood this, from the highest noble to the lowest servant. And no one understood it better than the woman who had promised him one, Anne Boleyn. She had captured the king's heart and mind, convinced him to break with the Catholic Church, cast aside his wife of 24 years, and change the course of English history, all on the promise of a legitimate male heir. The pressure on her was immense, almost unimaginable. When Anne finally became pregnant, the entire kingdom held its breath. Astrologers and physicians predicted a boy, a prince, to secure the Tudor line. The celebrations were planned, the jousts were organized, and the name was likely chosen. Henry, or perhaps Edward. But on September 7, 1533, the celebrations were cut short. Anne gave birth, not to a prince, but to a princess, a healthy, red-haired baby girl named Elizabeth. While a daughter was a disappointment, Henry didn't despair entirely. He was a young king in his early 40s, and Anne was still young. There would be more chances. He put on a brave face, and the christening was magnificent, though not as grand as it would have been for a boy. The court exhaled, cautiously optimistic. After all, a healthy child was a good sign. Surely a son would follow. Anne knew her work wasn't done. Her position as queen, her very life depended on fulfilling her promise. Soon after Elizabeth's birth, she was pregnant again. Hope soared once more. This time, it had to be a boy. But in the summer of 1534, the hope was shattered. Anne miscarried. It was a devastating blow, not just personally, but politically. The whispers started in the court corridors. Was the new queen cursed? Was God punishing Henry for his break with Rome? Henry's affection for Anne, once an all-consuming fire, began to cool. His public displays of adoration became less frequent. His frustration, a dangerous thing in a man with absolute power, started to simmer just beneath the surface. He began to spend more time with other ladies of the court, a clear and public signal of his displeasure. Anne, fiery and intelligent, did not take this well. She was not a submissive queen like Catherine of Aragon. She argued with Henry, her jealousy and insecurity flaring into public confrontations. This only pushed him further away. The supporters of the old queen, Catherine, and her daughter, Mary, felt emboldened. The Catholic powers of Europe watched from afar, hoping Henry's scandalous marriage would fail. Every stumble Anne made was magnified. Every sharp word she uttered was reported back to her enemies. Her own uncle, the powerful Duke of Norfolk, began to distance himself, sensing the shifting tides of royal favor. Then came another pregnancy in 1535. This was it. This had to be the one. The fate of the Queen and the future of the English Reformation rested on the outcome. But again, tragedy struck. Another miscarriage. The court gossiped mercilessly. The king's disappointment was now turning to cold anger. He began to openly question his marriage. Had he been deceived? Had he traded one barren wife for another? He had defied the Pope and alienated half of Europe for this woman, and she had failed to give him what he desired most. The final, fatal blow came in January 1536. Catherine of Aragon, Henry's first wife, died. For Anne, this should have been a moment of triumph. Her rival was gone. Her marriage was now, in the eyes of even the most devout Catholics, unquestionably legitimate. No one could claim she wasn't the true and only Queen of England. And, to top it all off, she was pregnant again. This time, she was certain it was a boy. She felt it. This was God's sign that her time had truly come. Then, disaster. On the day of Catherine of Aragon's funeral, Henry suffered a serious accident during a joust. He was knocked from his horse and lay unconscious for 2 hours. The news flew back to the palace, and a terrified, heavily pregnant Anne was thrown into a state of shock. Days later, she went into premature labor. She miscarried a son, a boy of about 15 weeks gestation. When Henry heard the news, his rage was absolute. The charm had worn off. The love was dead. He stormed into Anne's chambers and coldly declared, "I see that God will not give me male children." He accused her, saying he had been seduced into the marriage by sortileges and charms by witchcraft. That single word, witchcraft, sealed her fate. It was the opening her enemies, led by the calculating Thomas Cromwell, had been waiting for. They had a new candidate for queen waiting in the wings, the quiet, gentle Jane Seymour. With the king now convinced his marriage was cursed and illegitimate, Cromwell moved with chilling speed. A conspiracy was fabricated. Anne was accused of adultery with multiple men, including her own brother, George Boleyn. The charge was high treason. The accusations were absurd, the evidence non-existent. But it didn't matter. Henry wanted Anne gone, and the court knew better than to defy him. One by one, the accused men were arrested. Mark Smeaton, a court musician, confessed under horrific torture. The others, all gentlemen of the king's privy chamber, denied everything to the end, but they were condemned anyway. Anne's own trial was a spectacle. She faced her accusers, including her own uncle, with courage and dignity, denying all charges. But the verdict was a foregone conclusion. She was found guilty. Her brother, George, was tried and condemned on the flimsiest of evidence. The Boleyn faction, once the most powerful in England, was systematically dismantled. On May 19, 1536, less than 3 years after being crowned queen, Anne Boleyn was led to a private execution on Tower Green. She had asked for an expert swordsman from France to ensure a clean death. Her final speech was remarkable for its composure. She did not confess to the crime she was accused of, but she also did not blame the king. Knowing her daughter Elizabeth's life depended on it, she simply asked the crowd to pray for the king and for her own soul. With a single swift strike of the sword, the queen who had changed the course of English history was dead. The very next day, Henry VIII was formally betrothed to Jane Seymour. 11 days later, they were married. Henry finally got the son he craved when Jane gave birth to Prince Edward, but Jane herself died from complications of childbirth just days later. The king who had moved heaven and earth for a son had finally achieved his goal, but the cost was immense, paid in blood, betrayal, and the life of the woman he once claimed to love more than any other. And ironically, it would be the daughter Anne gave him, Elizabeth, who would go on to rule England for over 40 years, becoming one of its greatest and most beloved monarchs, securing the Tudor legacy in a way no son ever could. Thank you for watching. If you found this story as fascinating as we do, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next dive into history. See you next time.
Hey everyone, and welcome back to our deep dive into the Tudor court.
Today, we're re-exploring a moment that changed the course of English history forever. The fall of Anne Boleyn. It's a story of ambition, politics, religion, and ultimately, betrayal. To really understand what happened, we need to get inside the mind of King Henry VIII. For Henry, having a son wasn't just a personal wish, it was a political necessity. He had broken with the Catholic Church, declared himself the head of the Church of England, and risked war with the most powerful nations in Europe, all to marry Anne and secure a male heir. Without a legitimate son, the Tudor dynasty, which was still relatively new, was fragile. Henry had seen firsthand the devastation of the Wars of the Roses, a brutal civil war fought over the English throne. He was terrified that his death, without a clear male successor, would plunge England right back into that same chaos. The kingdom's stability, in his eyes, rested on the birth of a prince. Henry was also a deeply religious man. Though it might seem contradictory given his actions, he genuinely believed he had a special relationship with God. When things went well, it was a sign of divine favor. But when they went wrong, he saw it as divine punishment for his sins. This mindset is crucial. When Catherine of Aragon failed to give him a son, he became convinced their marriage was cursed by God because she had been his brother's wife. This belief was the justification for his great quest for an annulment. He had moved heaven and earth to marry Anne Boleyn, believing she was the one God had chosen to give him his long-awaited heir. The birth of Princess Elizabeth in 1533 was a disappointment, but hope was not lost. A daughter proved Anne could bear healthy children. A son would surely follow. But the years ticked by, and no son appeared. The pressure on Anne was immense, not just from Henry, but from the entire kingdom. Her position was entirely dependent on her ability to produce a male heir. She was the other woman in the eyes of many, the one who had displaced the beloved Queen, Catherine. Her supporters were a new faction, often tied to religious reform, while her enemies were powerful, conservative nobles who longed for a return to the old ways and the old alliances. Every month that passed without a pregnancy announcement weakened her position and emboldened her opponents. Then came the pivotal moment in January 1536. A double tragedy struck. On January 7th, Catherine of Aragon died. For Anne, this should have been a moment of triumph. Her rival was gone, and she was now the one and only undisputed Queen of England in the eyes of English law. There was no longer any question about the legitimacy of her marriage or the status of her children. But fate had a cruel twist in store. Just a few weeks later, on the very day of Catherine's funeral, Anne suffered a devastating miscarriage. It was a boy. For Henry, this was the final, undeniable proof. He had defied the Pope, torn his kingdom apart, and all for what? Another dead son. His belief system kicked in immediately. God was punishing him. But why? His marriage to Catherine was over. His marriage to Anne was supposed to be the divinely approved solution. If the problem wasn't the old marriage, he reasoned, then the problem must be the new one. His union with him must be cursed as well. It was the only explanation that made sense to his paranoid and self-righteous mind. And at this exact moment of crisis, Henry's eye had already started to wander. He had become infatuated with one of Anne's ladies-in-waiting, a quiet, gentle young woman named Jane Seymour. Jane was the complete opposite of the fiery, intelligent, and often confrontational Anne. Where Anne would argue with Henry and involve herself in politics, Jane was submissive and demure. She presented herself as the perfect, calming antidote to the drama of his marriage to Anne. As Henry's frustration with Anne grew, his affection for Jane blossomed. He saw in Jane the promise of a peaceful life and, more importantly, the potential for a son. This combination of events, the miscarriage and Henry's new infatuation, created a perfect storm. It was a signal to Anne's enemies that her time was running out. Powerful men at court who had long resented the Boleyn family's influence saw their chance. Chief among them was Thomas Cromwell, the king's chief minister. Cromwell was a brilliant, ruthless politician who had once been a key ally of the Boleyns. He had helped mastermind the break with Rome and Macon Queen, but his relationship with Anne had soured. They clashed over foreign policy and, more significantly, over what to do with the wealth seized from the monasteries. Anne wanted the money used for charitable and educational purposes. Cromwell wanted it to go to the king's treasury, which he controlled. As their disagreements grew more heated, Cromwell realized that as long as Anne was queen, his own power was limited. She was a political rival he could no longer manage. With the king now openly considering a replacement, Cromwell saw an opportunity not just to advance his own agenda, but to eliminate a threat. The old conservative nobility, led by families like the Howards ironically. Anne's own uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, was among them, also saw their opening. They had always despised the Boleyns as upstarts and heretics. They longed to restore the alliance with Spain and the Holy Roman Emperor, and for that to happen, the concubine, as they still privately called her, had to go. They began to subtly and not so subtly encourage the king's interest in Jane Seymour, whose family aligned with their conservative faction. The tide had turned against Anne with terrifying speed. Her influence, once so powerful that she could make or break careers, was evaporating. The king, who had once written her passionate love letters and defied the world for her, was now cold and distant. His heart was turning, and when the king's heart turned, the entire political landscape shifted with it. Anne was becoming isolated, surrounded by whispers and plots. Her every word and action was scrutinized, twisted, and reported back to her enemies. And tragically, the fate of her beloved brother, George Boleyn, Lord Rochford, was inextricably tied to hers. George was a charismatic, intelligent, and influential courtier in his own right. He was a gifted poet and diplomat, and a leading voice for religious reform. But above all, he was Anne's closest confidant and most loyal supporter. They were two parts of a whole, a dynamic duo at the center of the court. His power came from his sister's position. If the queen fell, her inner circle would fall with her. As her strongest and most prominent ally, George was the most obvious target for those who wanted to destroy her completely. Taking down Anne wasn't enough. They had to wipe out the entire Boleyn faction to ensure they could never rise again. Anne's failure to produce an heir wasn't just a personal tragedy or a marital disappointment. It was the crack in the foundation of her power. It was the vulnerability that her enemies had been waiting for, and it opened the door for Thomas Cromwell to orchestrate one of the most shocking and brutal political takedowns in English history. In the spring of 1536, a series of sensational accusations would be leveled against the queen and her circle. Accusations of adultery, incest, and treason. These charges would not only lead to Anne's execution, but would also bring her brother, George